Drake tightened the straps of his tool belt, the weight of his equipment a comforting familiarity. Alone in his workshop on Corvus 7, he had grown accustomed to the rhythm of solitude. The planet, barren and hostile, was the perfect place for someone seeking escape. Years ago, he had turned his back on Earth and the chaos of human civilization. There had been too much noise, political conflicts, corporate greed, and a constant pressure to conform. Drake wanted none of it. Corvus 7 offered isolation. Its corrosive winds and iron-rich sands didn't ask questions or judge his past. Here, Drake repaired mining rigs and designed machines for faceless clients who rarely demanded a status update. He found peace in the hum of his tools, the predictable resistance of metal beneath his hands. No colleagues, no expectations, no distractions. But tonight, the silence broke. A sudden explosion shook the ground beneath his workshop. The tremor rattled his tools and sent his chair rolling across the room. He froze, instinctively reaching for the plasma cutter on the nearest bench. Explosions weren't uncommon on Corvus 7. The volatile atmosphere sometimes sparked spontaneous bursts of fire, but this felt different. The sound had depth, a metallic resonance that spoke of something engineered, something catastrophic. Drake stepped outside into the sharp, bitter air. The horizon, typically obscured by a rust-colored haze, now blazed with orange and black. A plume of smoke spiraled upward, marking the crash site like an accusatory finger. His first thought was to ignore it. Crashes on this planet weren't his business. They were usually the result of smugglers or pirates misjudging Corvus 7's unpredictable gravity wells. Getting involved could bring trouble. But something about the smoke gnawed at him. It wasn't just the size of the plume. It was the faint greenish hue woven into the flames. He cursed under his breath, grabbing his coat and a portable scanner before heading out. The trek across the dunes was treacherous. Sandstorms had carved uneven ridges into the terrain, and Drake stumbled more than once. As he crested the final hill, the scene came into focus. A sleek alien ship lay in ruins, its hull split open like a gutted animal. The design was unfamiliar, the metal reflecting an iridescent green under the firelight. Sparks erupted from exposed circuits, and the stench of scorched fuel filled the air. Drake hesitated. His eyes scanned the debris for movement, expecting survivors or worse, scavengers. He gripped his plasma cutter tighter. Then he saw her. Pinned beneath a large fragment of the hull was a woman alien, unmistakably so. Her skin shimmered an otherworldly green, veins glowing faintly like threads of emerald light. She wasn't moving. Drake's first instinct was to turn back. He didn't know her anything, and getting involved could mean risking his own life. But then she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were enormous, entirely black save for tiny pinpricks of light that mirrored distant stars. Her gaze locked onto his, and in that moment he saw fear, pain, and something else, hope. Drake muttered a curse and rushed forward. "I'm not leaving you here," he said, knowing she couldn't understand him. He scanned the debris pinning her down. It was heavy, but not immovable. Grabbing a crowbar from his belt, he wedged it beneath the metal and heaved with all his strength. The fragment shifted but didn't budge. The ship groaned, the sound reverberating through the wreckage. Drake glanced around nervously. If there were other survivors or aggressors, they'd show up soon. He had to work faster. Bracing his foot against a jagged edge of the hull, he pushed again, his muscles straining against the weight. This time, the metal gave way, sliding off her with a deafening crash. Drake knelt beside her, scanning her injuries. Her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a deep gash ran along her side, seeping a viscous green fluid. More worrying was her stillness from the waist down. Paralysis, he thought grimly. "I've got you," he said, slipping his arms beneath her fragile frame. Her body was lighter than he expected, almost unnervingly so, but limp with exhaustion. Her skin was cool to the touch, and the glow of her veins flickered weakly, as if her body were losing power. The journey back to his workshop was agonizing. The dunes felt steeper, the air thicker. He could feel her shallow breaths against his chest, each one a reminder of how little time he had. When he finally reached the outpost, he kicked the door open and placed her carefully on his workbench. For a moment, he simply stared at her, unsure of where to start. Her anatomy was a puzzle: veins that glowed, skin that seemed almost translucent, and internal organs arranged in a way his scanner struggled to interpret. Drake wasn't a medic, but he was an engineer. He could solve problems, and right now, keeping her alive was the most pressing one. He sterilized the gash along her side, sealing it with a combination of adhesives and a makeshift cauterizer. Her breathing was shallow, her chest barely rising. Drake improvised a breathing tube, feeding oxygen directly into her lungs. For her paralysis, there was little he could do yet. He focused on stabilizing her, using nutrient solutions and monitoring her bioluminescence as a sign of recovery. Hours passed. The green glow of her veins grew steadier, though still faint. Drake wiped his brow, exhaustion settling over him. He didn't know who she was or why she was here, but one thing was clear: her arrival had just upended his carefully constructed solitude. As he sat beside her, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the outpost, the fragile thread of her life burned steadily against the encroaching darkness. Drake sat on a rusted stool, elbows resting on his workbench, his gaze fixed on the unconscious alien woman lying before him. Her translucent green skin glimmered faintly under the dim workshop lights, the bioluminescent veins that had once flickered erratically now pulsing with a steadier rhythm. She was alive for now. That thought brought little comfort. Survival on Corva 7 was unforgiving for even the fittest. For someone in her condition, it was a distant hope at best. The storm outside howled, shaking the metal walls of the outpost and drowning out the mechanical hum of the generator. Drake sighed and leaned back, his hand absently toying with a plasma cutter. He had spent years alone, but this kind of responsibility was new. Machines didn't care if he failed them, but she would. A soft sound broke his thoughts, a shallow, uneven breath. He leaned forward, watching as her eyelids fluttered open. Her star-flecked black eyes scanned the room, confused and disoriented. When they landed on him, they widened, the faint glow in her veins flickering brighter for a moment. "Hey," he said gently, raising his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "You're all right. You're safe." She flinched, trying to sit up, but her body betrayed her. Her arms trembled, and her legs remained motionless. She collapsed back onto the bench with a frustrated growl, a sound so raw and human that it caught Drake off guard. Her hands clenched into fists, and her glowing veins pulsed erratically, betraying her agitation. "Easy," Drake said, stepping closer but keeping his movements slow. "Don't push yourself. You're hurt, paralyzed, I think, but we'll figure this out." Her gaze darted to her legs, realization dawning as she tried and failed to move them. She let out a sharp cry, a guttural sound of despair that made Drake's chest tighten. He wanted to say something comforting, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he crouched beside her, meeting her eyes. "I'm going to help you," he said firmly. "You don't have to trust me yet, but I need you to stay still while I figure out how." Her luminous gaze softened slightly, and she nodded, a small, uncertain movement, but enough to signal she understood. Over the next few days, Drake threw himself into the challenge of keeping her alive. His scavenged medical supplies weren't designed for alien physiology, so every decision felt like a gamble. He crafted nutrient solutions, adjusting their composition based on how her bioluminescent veins reacted. When they brightened, he noted the ingredients. When they dimmed, he adjusted. Each trial brought him closer to understanding her biology, but it wasn't enough. Her paralysis remained, and her frustration grew. One afternoon, while Drake was repairing a damaged pump in the corner of the workshop, he heard a faint scraping noise. He turned to see her propping herself up on her elbows, her arms shaking under the effort. Before he could reach her, she collapsed back onto the bench, her glowing veins dimming with exhaustion. "Damn it, I told you to rest," he muttered, rushing to her side. She glared at him, her expression a mix of defiance and desperation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she reached out, tapping his chest with a trembling finger. "Drake," he said, understanding her unspoken question. He tapped his chest again. "My name's Drake." Her dark eyes narrowed in concentration. Slowly, she tapped her own chest. "Karen," she said, her voice soft but musical, the syllables rising and falling like a distant melody. Drake nodded. "Karen. All right, we're making progress." The breakthrough came one evening when Drake stumbled upon an idea while tinkering with a damaged servo motor. If he couldn't repair her body immediately, he could at least help her regain mobility with an exoskeleton. He sketched designs feverishly, his pencil scratching against the paper as his mind raced with possibilities. The exoskeleton needed to be lightweight, responsive, and adaptable to her unique anatomy. He scavenged parts from her ship, marveling at the alien alloys that were both strong and flexible. Karen watched him work, her luminous gaze sharp and curious. Occasionally she gestured at his sketches, miming suggestions. At first her input puzzled him, but as he watched her demonstrate the mechanics with her hands, he realized she understood more than he'd assumed. Her intelligence wasn't just intuitive, it was precise. "You're not just some passenger, are you?" Drake asked, holding up a sketch she'd corrected. She tilted her head, her glowing veins pulsing faintly, but offered no explanation. He chuckled softly. "All right, mystery woman. Let's see if we can get you moving." The storm outside had finally passed when Drake completed the first prototype. The exoskeleton was crude, its joints made from scavenged pistons and its frame held together with makeshift braces. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. Drake approached Karen with the device, his heart pounding. She watched him with a mix of anticipation and apprehension as he strapped the frame to her legs, adjusting the fit to accommodate her slender limbs. The bioluminescent veins in her thighs pulsed faintly as the exoskeleton's motors whirred to life. "All right," Drake said, stepping back. "Try it. Just a small movement." Karen's expression tightened in concentration. Slowly, her right leg lifted, the exoskeleton's servos humming softly with the effort. The motion was shaky, uneven, but unmistakable. For the first time since the crash, she moved. Her eyes widened, and her glowing veins brightened, pulsing with what Drake could only describe as joy. She turned to him, her lips parting in a soft, melodic laugh, a sound so unexpectedly beautiful that Drake found himself grinning. "Not bad, huh?" he said, crossing his arms. "We'll make it better." Karen nodded, determination etched into her features. Despite her exhaustion, her gaze burned with a newfound intensity. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were building something together. That night, as the outpost fell quiet, Drake found himself reflecting on how much had changed in so little time. Karen's presence had disrupted the routine he'd built over years of isolation, but it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like purpose. As he sat beside her, sketching improvements for the exoskeleton, he realized he wasn't just trying to help her walk again. He was trying to give them both a reason to keep moving forward in a world that often felt too still. Outside, the stars glittered, and for the first time in years, Drake felt like he wasn't alone under their light. The outpost was eerily quiet as Drake tightened the final bolt on the exoskeleton. The servos whirred softly as he tested their range of motion, the device moving fluidly in his hands. It was his third iteration, lighter, stronger, more precise. He glanced at Karen, who sat on the bench nearby, her sharp black eyes tracking his every movement. Her bioluminescent veins pulsed faintly, their rhythm steady but subdued, reflecting her cautious anticipation. "This should feel more natural," Drake said, setting the exoskeleton beside her. "We'll take it slow. No heroics." Karen raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smirk. She didn't need to speak for Drake to understand her silent challenge. "Watch me." He helped her strap the exoskeleton onto her legs, ensuring each joint aligned perfectly with her unique anatomy. When the final clasp clicked into place, she sat still, her fingers resting lightly on the bench. The faint hum of the motors filled the silence. "Try standing," Drake urged, stepping back. Karen inhaled deeply and pressed her palms against the bench. The exoskeleton's servos activated with a soft hiss, amplifying her effort. Slowly, shakily, she rose to her feet. Her veins brightened, glowing with what Drake could only describe as triumph. For a moment, she simply stood there, her tall, slender frame illuminated by her bioluminescent glow. Then she took a step. The motion was uneven but deliberate, the exoskeleton responding smoothly to her movements. Karen let out a soft, melodic sound, a laugh, low and musical. Drake couldn't help but grin, his chest tightening with relief and pride. "I'd say that's a success," he said, crossing his arms. "Just don't go running any marathons yet." Karen took another step, then another, her confidence growing. But just as she turned toward him, the outpost's alarm blared, shattering the moment. The sound was harsh, a mechanical wail that sent adrenaline surging through Drake's veins. "What the hell?" he muttered, rushing to the control panel. Karen followed as quickly as she could, her movements still unsteady. Drake's fingers flew over the console, his eyes scanning the data feed. The proximity sensors had detected movement, multiple signals closing fast. His stomach dropped as he pulled up the external cameras. A cluster of figures moved across the dunes, their silhouettes backlit by the dim glow of the storm's remnants. They were humanoid but heavily armored, their forms bristling with weapons, scavengers, or worse. They must have picked up the transponder signal before I destroyed it, Drake said, his voice tight. We've got company. Karen stepped beside him, her eyes narrowing as she studied the screen. She reached out, tapping one of the figures, then drew a sharp line across her throat with her finger. Her meaning was clear. These weren't negotiators. Drake grabbed his plasma cutter and a makeshift rifle from the wall. Stay here, he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Karen shook her head, her veins glowing brighter. She pointed at the exoskeleton, then at herself, her expression fierce. Drake hesitated. She was still recovering, her body fragile despite the exoskeleton's support. But the determination in her eyes was undeniable. Fine, he said, handing her a small welding torch. But stay close and let me handle this. The intruders reached the outpost's perimeter within minutes, their boots crunching against the gravel. Drake crouched behind a stack of crates near the entrance, his pulse pounding in his ears. Karen knelt beside him, her movements surprisingly fluid despite her limited experience with the exoskeleton. The first figure stepped into the open, their armor glinting under the harsh lights of the outpost. Drake recognized the insignia on their chest plate, a crimson claw, the mark of a notorious scavenger syndicate. He tightened his grip on the rifle. We know you're in there, one of them called, their voice distorted by a helmet modulator. Hand over the alien, and we'll make this quick. Drake glanced at Karen, whose veins flared brightly in response. Her gaze was sharp, calculating. She raised her hand, motioning for him to wait. What are you thinking? Drake whispered, but she didn't respond. Instead, she reached into the pouch strapped to her waist, a piece of equipment salvaged from her ship, and pulled out a small spherical device. Its surface shimmered faintly, covered in alien symbols. What is that? Drake asked, his voice low. Karen pressed a button on the sphere, and it began to pulse with a soft, rhythmic glow. She tossed it toward the scavengers, the device rolling to a stop near their leader's feet. The scavenger bent down to inspect it. The explosion was instantaneous. A burst of light and sound erupted from the sphere, sending the scavengers sprawling. Drake stared, stunned, as Karen rose to her feet, her expression unreadable. Without hesitation, she moved toward the entrance, her steps steady despite the chaos. Wait, Drake hissed, scrambling after her. The remaining scavengers recovered quickly, their weapons trained on Karen as she stepped into the open. One of them fired, but she moved with surprising agility, the exoskeleton amplifying her reflexes. The shot missed, scorching the wall behind her. Drake raised his rifle and fired, the blast striking one of the attackers square in the chest. They collapsed with a grunt, their weapon clattering to the ground. The others turned their attention to him, giving Karen the opening she needed. She darted forward, using the welding torch to disable another scavenger. The exoskeleton's enhanced strength allowed her to knock the weapon from their hands, and with a swift motion she disabled their armor's power supply. They crumpled to the ground, motionless. The fight was over within minutes. The remaining scavengers fled, their retreat marked by panicked shouts. Drake lowered his rifle, his hands trembling. Karen stood beside him, her veins glowing brightly, her expression resolute. Well, Drake said, his voice shaky. That was unexpected. Karen turned to him, her lips curving into a faint smile. She raised her hand, mimicking a gesture he had taught her earlier, a thumbs up. Drake couldn't help but laugh, the tension in his chest easing. You're full of surprises, he said, shaking his head. As they returned to the workshop, Drake realized something had shifted. Karen was no longer just a survivor. She was a fighter, someone who refused to be defined by her injuries or circumstances. And for the first time, he felt the spark of something he hadn't experienced in years, hope. Drake stood in the shadow of the repaired alien ship, its humming engines filling the air with a low, rhythmic pulse. The sleek, iridescent hull bore the scars of its crash but gleamed faintly under the outpost's lights. It was ready to fly, or so he hoped. Beside him, Karen adjusted the straps of her exoskeleton, her dark eyes scanning the ship with an intensity that mirrored his own apprehension. You sure about this? Drake asked, his voice steady but heavy with doubt. He wiped his hands on a grease-streaked rag, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. Because once we're up there, there's no turning back. Karen turned to him, her glowing veins pulsing softly. Sure, she said, her accent thick but her tone resolute. She tapped the side of her head, then pointed to the triangular device in her hand, the map that had guided their frantic repairs. This way. Drake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Right. Follow the flickering signal to who knows where. No problem. Karen smirked faintly, a rare expression that softened her usually sharp features. She stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. Drake, trust. The word hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Drake nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He didn't have a choice, not really. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger, a fight neither of them could afford to ignore. They boarded the ship in silence, the weight of their mission pressing down like the gravity of Corva 7 itself. The interior was dimly lit, the controls a mix of smooth organic curves and glowing symbols that pulsed in time with the ship's systems. Drake took the co-pilot's seat, his fingers hovering uncertainly over the alien controls. Karen slid into the pilot's chair, her movements fluid despite the exoskeleton's mechanical hiss. She pressed her hand against a glowing panel, and the ship responded instantly, the hum of its engines growing louder. The cockpit's display flickered to life, showing a vast starfield with a single, pulsing waypoint, a beacon calling them into the unknown. Drake leaned forward, studying the display. "That's our target," he asked. Karen nodded. "Yes, beacon safe?" Drake snorted. "Safe? I'll believe that when we land." Karen didn't respond. Instead, she engaged the thrusters, and the ship lifted off with a smooth, effortless motion. The outpost shrank below them, its harsh metal structures blending into the red dunes of Corva 7. For a moment, Drake felt a pang of regret leaving it behind. It had been his sanctuary for years, a place where the galaxy's chaos couldn't reach him. But now, as the ship pierced through the planet's atmosphere, he realized that isolation wasn't the same as freedom. Hours passed in the quiet hum of the ship, the stars outside stretching into thin streaks as they entered faster than light travel. Drake tinkered with a console, trying to distract himself from the weight of their mission. Karen sat nearby, her eyes fixed on the map projection, her expression unreadable. "Mind telling me what we're walking into?" Drake asked, breaking the silence. "You've been pretty quiet about this whole bigger threat thing." Karen hesitated, her glowing veins dimming slightly. "Hunters," she said finally. "They find us, always." "Hunters," Drake repeated, his stomach tightening. "And by us you mean your people?" Karen nodded, her gaze distant. "We run, hide. They follow." Drake frowned, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "And this beacon we're chasing, is it more of your people? A safe haven?" Karen shook her head. "Not people, weapon." Drake froze. "A weapon? You've been leading me to a weapon this whole time?" She turned to him, her expression fierce. "Not for war, for stop." Drake leaned back in his seat, processing her words. "You think this thing can stop them? The hunters?" "Yes," Karen said, her voice steady. "Must try." Drake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "All right, let's just hope it's not guarded by something worse." Their destination came into view hours later, a massive structure floating in the void, its surface bristling with spires and glowing with faint, rhythmic lights. It looked ancient, its design both alien and organic, like a living creature frozen in time. The beacon pulsed at its center, a steady call that resonated through the ship's systems. Karen guided the ship toward a docking port, her movements precise but tense. Drake watched the structure grow larger on the display, his unease mounting. "This thing doesn't exactly scream welcome, does it?" Karen ignored him, focusing on the landing sequence. The ship docked with a gentle hiss, the engines powering down as the docking clamps secured them in place. Karen stood, her glowing veins pulsing brightly. "Come," she said, her voice firm. Drake grabbed his tools and a makeshift weapon, following her into the airlock. The doors opened with a hiss, revealing a dark, cavernous corridor that stretched into the structure's depths. The air was thin and cold, carrying a faint metallic tang. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls pulsed faintly, as if the entire structure were alive. Drake's grip on his weapon tightened. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered. Karen glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "Safe, for now." Drake snorted. "Great, that's reassuring." The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. At the center stood a massive console, its surface covered in alien glyphs that glowed faintly. The beacon's signal pulsed stronger here, a rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the floor. Karen approached the console, her glowing veins flaring brightly as she placed her hand on its surface. The glyphs responded instantly, shifting and rearranging themselves. A deep hum filled the chamber as the beacon's energy intensified. Drake stayed back, his eyes scanning the room for threats. "Tell me this thing isn't going to blow up in our faces." Karen didn't answer. Her focus was entirely on the console. The glyphs pulsed faster, the beacon's light growing brighter. Then, with a sudden surge of energy, the console emitted a burst of light that engulfed the room. Drake shielded his eyes, his heart pounding. When the light faded, he lowered his arm and stared. A new display hovered above the console, showing a fleet of ships moving toward Corva 7, the hunters. Karen's expression hardened. "They come." Drake stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "Then we make sure they regret it." The console emitted another pulse, and the glyphs rearranged into a series of symbols that Karen recognized instantly. She turned to Drake, her dark eyes blazing. "Weapon ready." Drake nodded, his resolve solidifying. Together they would stand against whatever came next. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The massive console pulsed with a steady rhythm, its alien glyphs casting faint shadows across the cavernous chamber. Drake stood at its edge, his hand gripping his makeshift rifle as he scanned the display hovering above it. The fleet of enemy ships was closer than he'd expected, their angular silhouettes a stark contrast against the void of space. Each one moved with purpose, like predatory animals honing in on wounded prey. Karen remained focused on the console, her glowing veins bright and steady as her fingers glided over its surface. The glyphs shifted under her touch, responding to commands Drake couldn't hope to understand. The hum of the beacon grew louder, resonating through the floor. "How much time do we have?" Drake asked, his voice tight. Karen paused, her dark, starry eyes meeting his. "Not enough," she said. Her words, though sparse, carried a weight that made his stomach clench. Drake exhaled sharply, pacing a few steps before stopping to lean against a nearby pillar. "So what's the plan? You said this thing's a weapon, but I'm not seeing any big guns. Does it shoot lasers? Launch missiles? Scare them off with bright lights?" Karen gave him a sharp look, her bioluminescent veins flickering briefly with irritation. "Not simple," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It turned them." "Turn them?" Drake frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Karen pressed her palm against the console, and the display shifted. A new image appeared, an intricate diagram of what looked like a neural network, its glowing pathways branching out like veins. At its center pulsed a massive node radiating energy. "This," Karen said, pointing to the node. "Their minds connect. Beacon disrupts." Drake stared at the display, his brow furrowing. "You're saying it's not a weapon? It's mind control?" Karen shook her head. "Not control. Free." Drake let out a low whistle, leaning closer to the display. "You're telling me these hunters are somehow enslaved? Controlled by something?" Karen nodded, her expression grim. "Their leader. Always watching. Always forcing." Drake ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "And this thing can break that control?" "Yes," Karen said, her voice steady but urgent. "If ready." The chamber's hum deepened as Karen continued her work, her hands moving with precise, deliberate motions. Drake kept his weapon at the ready, his eyes darting between the display and the dark corridors surrounding them. The beacon's activation was bound to attract attention, and he wasn't about to let them be caught off guard. A sudden metallic clang echoed through the chamber, and Drake's grip on his rifle tightened. He spun toward the sound, his heart pounding as shadows shifted at the far end of the room. The faint red glow of a scanner cut through the darkness, followed by the unmistakable thud of boots on metal. "We've got company," Drake muttered, stepping closer to Karen. "How much longer do you need?" Karen didn't look up, almost. Drake cursed under his breath. "That's not good enough." The first hunter stepped into the light, a hulking figure clad in sleek, dark armor, its visor glowing crimson. It moved with a predator's grace, its weapon already raised. Drake fired first, the sharp crack of his rifle echoing through the chamber. The shot struck the hunter's shoulder, sending it staggering back. Two more hunters emerged, their movements swift and coordinated. Drake ducked behind a pillar as a volley of energy blast ricocheted off the walls. "Any time now, Karen," he shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. Karen's glowing veins flared brightly as she pressed a final sequence of commands into the console. The beacon's hum reached a deafening crescendo, and a wave of energy radiated outward, sending a shockwave rippling through the room. The hunters froze mid-step, their weapons falling to their sides. Drake peeked out from behind the pillar, his rifle still raised. What just happened? Karen stepped away from the console, her expression weary but resolute. Beacon start. The hunters stood motionless, their glowing visors dimming as the neural network's diagram on the display shifted. The beacon's energy pulsed rhythmically, disrupting the connection that had bound them. One by one, the hunters collapsed to their knees, their armor slack and their movements sluggish. Drake approached cautiously, his weapon trained on the nearest figure. Are they dead? Karen shook her head. Not dead, free. Drake lowered his rifle slightly, studying the hunter's motionless form. So they were slaves? Mindless puppets? Yes, Karen said, her voice tinged with sadness. Now, choice. The beacon continued to pulse as Karen turned back to the console, her movements slower now, as though the effort had drained her. Drake stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the display. The enemy fleet was still en route, but the beacon's energy was spreading, its reach growing with each pulse. How do we know this will work on the rest of them? Drake asked, his voice steady but wary. Karen hesitated, not sure. Drake sighed, leaning his hands on the console. Of course not. Nothing's ever easy. Karen placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. Must try, she said, her gaze meeting his. Together. Drake looked at her for a long moment before nodding. All right, together. The remaining hours passed in a blur of preparation. Karen worked tirelessly to amplify the beacon's reach, while Drake fortified the chamber's defenses, using whatever scraps and tools he could find. They both knew the fleet's arrival was inevitable, and the beacon's success was far from guaranteed. When the fleet finally appeared on the display, a wave of dread washed over Drake. The ships were massive, their sleek forms bristling with weapons. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, their trajectories converging on the beacon's location. Here we go, Drake muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. Karen activated the beacon's final sequence, her glowing veins pulsing brighter than ever. The structure around them vibrated as the beacon unleashed its full power, a blinding wave of light that surged outward, enveloping the approaching fleet. Drake shielded his eyes, his heart pounding as the light faded. When he looked back at the display, the enemy ships had stopped. They hovered in place, their weapons silent, their formations broken. Karen exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging with relief. It works. Drake let out a shaky laugh, slumping against the console. You weren't kidding about that trust thing. Karen turned to him, her dark eyes softening. You help, not alone. Drake nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Not alone. As the fleet began to retreat, their captains now free from the control that had bound them, Drake and Karen stood together in the glow of the beacon. They had faced impossible odds and survived, not through brute force but through trust, determination, and the unyielding belief that even the darkest chains could be broken. For the first time in years, Drake felt a glimmer of hope not just for himself, but for the galaxy they had fought to protect. The air inside the beacon chamber felt lighter as the final pulses of energy dissipated. The glow of the alien console dimmed, leaving the room bathed in a softer, calmer light. Drake leaned against the console, his weapon resting at his side. His chest rose and fell with measured breaths as the weight of their success began to settle in. Karen stood nearby, her glowing veins pulsing faintly. The brightness that had flared during the beacon's activation had waned, replaced by a soft, steady rhythm. She looked at the display where the enemy fleet had broken formation and was retreating into the void. Their ships, once instruments of destruction, drifted like leaves caught in a gentle current. You did it, Drake said, his voice cutting through the stillness. We did it. Karen turned to him, her star-flecked eyes meeting his. They free, she said, her voice quieter than usual but resolute. Drake nodded. And alive. That's more than I thought we'd walk away with. The tension that had gripped them for days began to unravel. Drake allowed himself a brief smile, one that faded as he glanced at Karen's face. Her expression was still, but her eyes betrayed a hint of something deeper, uncertainty perhaps. What now? He asked, his tone softening. You've been fighting these hunters your whole life. Does it end here? Karen was silent for a moment, her gaze drifting back to the display. End for some. Others come. Drake sighed. So it's not over. Not over, Ka-Ren confirmed. She stepped closer to the console, her glowing fingers brushing the alien glyphs. But better. Drake crossed his arms, watching her. That's enough for now, I guess. The walk back to their ship was slow, both of them weighed down by exhaustion. The corridors of the beacon structure were silent, the faint hum of its energy now a soothing background presence. As they neared the docking bay, Drake couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, half expecting another ambush. But there was nothing, just the soft glow of the walls and the sound of their footsteps. When they reached the ship, Ka-Ren paused at the entrance, her hand resting on the hull. Her gaze lingered on the beacon's towering spires visible through the bay's translucent ceiling. Drake stopped beside her, following her line of sight. It's impressive, he said, breaking the silence. I mean, it nearly killed us, but it's impressive. Ka-Ren let out a soft, melodic laugh, the kind that always caught Drake off guard. Impressive, she repeated, her accent stretching the word into something almost musical. Drake smirked. Yeah, you're picking up the lingo. Ka-Ren smiled faintly but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned toward him, her glowing veins brightening slightly. Drake, she said, her voice soft but deliberate. Thank you. Drake shrugged, his voice light but sincere. Hey, it's not every day I get dragged into saving the galaxy. Figured I'd give it a shot. Ka-Ren's gaze lingered on him, her glowing veins pulsing warmly. Not just galaxy, she said, her tone serious. Me. Drake blinked, caught off guard by the weight of her words. You don't have to thank me for that, he said quietly. I couldn't have done it without you. Ka-Ren stepped closer, her dark eyes fixed on his. Drake, she said, her voice steady but trembling at the edges. You save more than life. You save heart. Drake's throat tightened. For a moment he was silent, searching her face for the meaning behind her words. He found it there in her eyes, in the soft glow of her veins, in the way she looked at him as though he were more than just a fleeting presence in her life. I think you did the same for me, he said, his voice low but firm. Ka-Ren, I don't think I've felt this alive in years, and I don't think I could have done this without you. You're everything. Ka-Ren's glowing veins brightened as she reached out, her hand brushing lightly against his. Drake, she said slowly, carefully forming the words, I love you. The words hung in the air, soft yet powerful. Drake felt his chest tighten, a warmth spreading through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. He placed his hand over hers, his voice steady. I love you too, Ka-Ren. Her smile widened, and for the first time her bioluminescence seemed to shine brighter than the beacon itself. The journey back to Corva 7 was quieter than Drake expected. The ship hummed softly as it drifted through the void, its once damaged systems running smoothly after their repairs. Drake sat in the co-pilot's seat, absently tinkering with a piece of salvaged alien tech. Ka-Ren was at the helm, her focus on the faint, red-tinged sphere of Corva 7 growing larger on the display. You know, Drake said, breaking the silence, you're going to need a plan for what comes next. Can't exactly live out the rest of your days hunting these guys. Not alone. Ka-Ren glanced at him but said nothing. I mean it, Drake continued. You've got this beacon now, a weapon that can stop them. You could bring your people back together, build something bigger than just running. Ka-Ren tilted her head, her dark eyes thoughtful. Together? Drake nodded. Yeah, together. Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. And you? Drake hesitated. He had spent years on Corva 7 because it was simple, isolated. But now, after everything, the idea of going back to that life felt hollow. He met Ka-Ren's gaze and shrugged. Guess I'm sticking around. Someone's got to keep you out of trouble. Ka-Ren laughed softly, her glowing veins brightening. You stay? Drake leaned back in his seat, a grin tugging at his lips. Looks like it. When they landed on Corva 7, the planet felt different. The storm clouds that had once dominated its skies had parted, revealing patches of pale light. Drake stepped out of the ship and took a deep breath, the dry, metallic tang of the air oddly refreshing. Ka-Ren followed, her movements fluid despite the hiss of her exoskeleton. She stood beside him, her gaze sweeping across the landscape. This place isn't much, Drake said, gesturing to the barren dunes. But it's home. For now. Ka-Ren nodded. Home, good. Drake chuckled. You're really getting the hang of this language thing. Ka-Ren smiled, her expression warm. Good teacher. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling into something lighter, something hopeful. The hunters might still be out there, but for now they had a chance to rebuild, to rest, to plan for what came next. Drake turned to Karen, his voice steady. All right, what's next? Beacon maintenance? Galactic diplomacy? Karen shook her head, her bioluminescent veins pulsing faintly. Next, rebuild. Together. Drake grinned. Together. As the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the rust-colored dunes, Drake and Karen stood side by side. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were something stronger, something new. And in that moment, under the vast, open sky, they knew they had finally found their place. Together.